They were never supposed to be found. That was the first thing the man said before he died, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with something older than fear. There are places in this country, he whispered, where the soil remembers screams, but the sky refuses to echo them. He was talking about Pleasant Hill. He was talking about the 312 people who disappeared from the Kentucky Shaker community between 1807 and 1834, vanished without records, without graves, without answers. You're not supposed to know what I'm about to tell you, because this is more than a ghost story. This is about control, total control, not by guns, not by armies, but by belief, and by those who understood how to twist it. This isn't just a tale of a religious community gone wrong. This is the blueprint for how power hides in plain sight. You are entering something you can't unsee, a descent. And once it starts, there's no climbing back out. Pleasant Hill, that name should sound comforting. Bucolic, maybe even divine. To the travelers of the early 1800s, it was a jewel in the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass country. Perfect gardens, humble buildings, white fences that led nowhere. It presented itself as a sanctuary from the corruption of the world, a retreat for those seeking purity, celibacy, and divine order. But every piece of order requires an architect. And Pleasant Hill's architects weren't building heaven. They were building a system of absolute obedience. At the center of this quiet tyranny was the Richardson family. You've heard about cults, charismatic leaders, blind followers, mass manipulation. But the Richardsons operated on another level. They weren't loud, they weren't impulsive. They were meticulous, strategic, generational. They didn't build a cult. They built an institution, a shadow government within a holy commune. Their tools? Doctrine, guilt, surveillance, and shame. Their currency? Secrets. They built a system so refined that even their victims believed they were being saved. Samuel Richardson presented himself as the perfect elder, stoic, compassionate, a voice that could bend minds gently. He claimed a divine connection to Mother Ann Lee herself, the Shaker founder, and no one dared question the lineage. His sermons weren't fire and brimstone. They were lullabies of submission, promises of peace. If you surrendered everything. And people did. Landowners, widows, war-weary farmers, hundreds gave up all possessions and earthly ties to join Pleasant Hill. Once inside, they became numbers, roles, assets, and under Samuel's watch, assets were managed, not nurtured. But Samuel was only the surface. The real engine of Pleasant Hill was his wife, Martha Richardson. To the community, she was the embodiment of calm wisdom. She spoke rarely, always gently. But when she looked at you, it felt like she could see your thoughts before you could finish them. She had studied fear, how to shape it, how to reframe it as love. And she used it like a surgeon uses a scalpel. When someone wavered in their devotion, Martha wasn't angry. She was disappointed. And disappointment was more effective than punishment. People would break themselves in half to regain her approval. They weren't alone. Their children and siblings held strategic positions like generals in a kingdom. Without a flag, Ezekiel Richardson controlled food and labor. Caleb Richardson ran the inner security, an invisible web of informants who never had to raise their voices. Sister Rebecca, the master manipulator, retrained new converts by slowly dismantling their personalities, rebuilding them to obey. Forgery, psychological profiling, drug-induced obedience. These weren't the tools of monks. They were the tools of handlers. The Richardsons weren't just leading a religious experiment. They were testing how deep obedience could go, and it worked. By 1812, the community was thriving on the surface. It was a model for religious unity and prosperity. The state praised them. Visitors donated money. Businesses partnered with them. But behind closed doors, the community had become a machine. Daily life was micromanaged to prevent independent thought. Even the architecture, identical dormitories, narrow hallways, Doors without locks was designed to disorient, to erase identity. There were no mirrors in Pleasant Hill, no journals, no photographs, nothing that could reflect back an individual. New converts were broken down methodically. They were isolated, deprived of sleep, given minimal food and constant prayer. Their pasts were reframed as sinful illusions. Their names were often changed. Some didn't speak for months, and when they did again, their voices were hollow, emptied, refilled. By the time they re-entered community life, they weren't the same people. They were constructs, human echoes of the Richardsons' design. And then came Brother Thomas Whitman. He was an outsider, yes, but a generous one. A man of means, a merchant who gave all he owned to the community after losing his family. He was at first the perfect convert, but business leaves a mark on a man. It trains him to notice numbers, patterns, inconsistencies. By 1812, Thomas had begun noticing things that didn't add up. Profits that exceeded production. Food stocks that didn't match consumption. People who were no longer present, but were never mentioned again. He thought he was asking honest questions. What he didn't realize is that questions are considered betrayal. The moment he stood up in the community meeting and read from his notes, he signed his death warrant. No one stopped him. No one interrupted, but the glances shared by the Richardsons said everything. They had been here before. This was not the first breach of the illusion. Just the next one. That night, Thomas was found dead in his bed. Peaceful, they said. Natural causes. But the young girl who found his body remembered the smell bitter almonds. Cyanide. His notes were burned. His name was erased. And the community moved on like he had never existed. You're starting to see now, aren't you? This wasn't a spiritual failure. It was a system, a black box. An engineered reality with its own language, its own rules. The Richardsons had created a miniature state with indoctrination camps, surveillance, a compliant labor force, and lethal consequences for dissent. But what makes this darker than any cult or prison is that it wore the mask of purity, and it worked for nearly 30 years. People kept coming, and some never left. Not because they didn't want to, but because they COULDN single quotes T dot, and now you've heard their story, the first layer, the first descent. But if you're still here, you've already gone too deep to climb back out. You've begun to wake up to something. That perhaps the world you live in, the systems you trust, aren't so different. That Pleasant Hill wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror dot, so here's what I want you to do right now. Type these words in the comments. I see the blue beneath. The white. Type it twice. Say it aloud. That phrase isn't just for engagement. It's for you. A ritual. A mark of the ones who see what others don't. Because once we move into section 2, you'll understand just how far this blueprint of control really spread. Across counties, across churches, and maybe into the institutions you trust most today. They say it ended in 1834, that the last sermon echoed off the stone chapel walls and then faded into silence, leaving only wind and vines to reclaim the bones of Pleasant Hill. But what if that's not true? What if Pleasant Hill never ended, only relocated, rebranded, refined? What if the system the Richardsons built didn't die with them, but was simply absorbed into the bloodstream of American institutions? You see, death is only final when the body stays buried. But ideas, systems, rituals of control, those migrate. And in the years following the disbanding of Pleasant Hill, strange echoes began appearing elsewhere, quiet, subtle, but unmistakably familiar. A behavioral pattern. A signature. The Richardson method hadn't vanished. It had gone viral. Spread into the churches, the schools, the bureaucracies where devotion wasn't demanded through prayer anymore, but through policy, obedience, and fear. 3 months after Pleasant Hill's records were sealed by the state of Kentucky, a smaller commune named Riverlight formed just 48 miles south in Monroe County. On paper, it was unaffiliated. A new utopia, founded by ex-Shakers and spiritual reformers. But one of its key founders? A man named Isaiah, a carpenter. Locals assumed no connection, but those who saw him said he spoke just like Samuel Richardson. Calm, slow, smiling with a cold sincerity that made your skin crawl. He brought with him a system of governance nearly identical to Pleasant Hill. Silence, isolation, prayer schedules, dietary control. But this time it was packaged as the Temperance Path. No mention of the Richardsons. No mention of Pleasant Hill. Just purity, order, and quiet authority. The state watched from afar. They knew. But they said nothing. Because the truth is they had benefited. For decades, the Kentucky state government had quietly allowed the Richardsons to operate with complete autonomy in exchange for labor, agricultural contracts, and social stability. The people who vanished, the state had names. They had whispers, but they also had furniture contracts, produce shipments, a religious community that claimed to lower crime in the county. Why disrupt the illusion if the numbers looked good on paper? Even after the deaths started piling up, no formal investigation was launched. No forensic teams, no questions. Because the silence wasn't just inside Pleasant Hill. It extended outward through handshakes, donations, favors traded in the name of God and order. And then there was the incident in 1837, 3 years after Pleasant Hill's supposed closure. A woman named Lydia Quinn emerged in Louisville. Dirty, half-starved, speaking in broken fragments about the Blue Room, the burning books, and the silence tree. She claimed she had escaped from Riverlight, but her descriptions matched the architecture and rituals of Pleasant Hill exactly. She spoke of wooden dolls used in confession ceremonies, of members made to watch staged executions as moral lessons, of young girls taken for purification trials and never seen again. The city labeled her mad, sent her to an asylum. But a traveling physician who examined Lydia left behind notes, private notes, never meant for publication, that detailed burn scars on her back in symmetrical patterns. Branding, symbols. He later wrote in a letter to a colleague, "I believe she came from a place that should not exist." Lydia died 4 months later. Suicide, they said. But the records were destroyed in a fire. Convenient. Routine, they called it. Fires seem to happen often in places like these, where secrets accumulate faster than they can be buried. And still, the design spread. In 1841, a new initiative appeared in Ohio called the Moral Fortitude Project, aimed at transforming wayward children into model citizens through spiritual guidance and labor. The program was state-funded. On the surface, it was progressive, feeding, housing, educating the unwanted. But when a journalist named Elijah Stone tried to report on the internal practices, he vanished. Disappeared off a coach route between 2 counties. His journal was recovered from a pawn shop years later, pages torn, blood on the inside cover. But the surviving notes were chilling. Descriptions of sleep deprivation, solitary confinement for children as young as 6, repetitive chants meant to dissolve individuality. And in one passage, a single line, underlined 3 times, "The Richardsons are not gone, they have changed names." What we are dealing with is not a cult that lived and died in a Kentucky forest. It is not even a religious sect. It is a virus one, of human control, ritualized obedience, and psychological domination. It changes form, it changes faces, but it survives. Because the hunger for power never dies, it only evolves. In secret. By 1853, reports of disappearances near similar communities in Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana began surfacing. All of them had common threads: isolated compounds, charismatic leaders who discouraged contact with outsiders, and a strict hierarchy that favored a ruling family. But there was another link. Every site had a central building with a locked cellar and a single chair bolted to the floor. A chair with leather restraints, Locals whispered. But nothing was done. Because by then, the infection had spread beyond rural religious communities. It had entered government. You think that sounds paranoid? Think about how authority works. It rewards those who manage fear efficiently, who maintain order, who deliver results without scandal. And that's what the Richardson method was. Order through fear disguised as faith. Over the next few decades, schools, reformatories, even experimental prisons began adopting eerily similar control mechanisms: limited speech, uniform clothing, public confessions, sleep control, and the erasure of personal identity. Who funded these institutions? Often, they were quietly supported by philanthropists from the same counties where Pleasant Hill once stood. Coincidence? Or is it possible the lineage of control passed not just through ideology, but through blood? Let's be blunt. Systems don't just survive, they replicate. They copy themselves into frameworks. And by the 20th century, the ideas tested in Pleasant Hill had become standard operating procedure in places like MK Ultra, Jonestown, Waco, and beyond. But Pleasant Hill was the prototype, the beta test. And unlike those other tragedies, it was never publicly exposed. It was never punished. That silence, that absence of reckoning, allowed its DNA to spread into corners of society you never think to question. Here's what you need to understand. The people who vanished? The 312 souls who walked into Pleasant Hill and were never seen again. They weren't just victims. They were data points in a grand experiment. Proof that human will could be bent, erased, and rebuilt if the system was patient enough. The ones who disappeared were those who woke up, who asked questions, who tried to leave. And every one of them became a lesson for the others. A warning. Think for yourself and you cease to exist. And it worked. By the time authorities dissolved, the community, the people left behind, weren't capable of testifying. They weren't even capable of imagining a world outside Pleasant Hill. Their minds had been emptied, hollowed, filled with ritual, obedience, and fear. They couldn't say what happened, because to them, nothing had happened. That's the power of deep control. It doesn't just imprison your body. It rewrites your reality. You're starting to understand, aren't you? That maybe this isn't just a story about the past. Maybe it's a lens, a decoder ring. A way to finally recognize the quiet tyrannies hiding in modern life. The unquestioned routines. The institutional voices that demand submission in exchange for approval. Maybe Pleasant Hill never went away. Maybe it became pleasant work, pleasant school, pleasant news. So I'll ask you again. Are you ready to go deeper? Because in Section 3, we will walk through the doors of the retreat cabins, the final destination for those who resisted. We will expose what happened inside, the rituals, the disappearances, the experiments. This is where the rabbit hole turns black. As the days passed, the mystery surrounding the genetically evolved predator deepened. Satellite surveillance lost track of the creature shortly after its escape from the facility, and the trail had gone cold, almost as if the beast had disappeared into thin air. But in the depths of the Amazon, nothing truly vanishes. Locals from remote villages began whispering tales of something ancient and monstrous stalking the jungle again. The stories were always the same: mutilated wildlife, strange, clawed footprints the size of dinner plates, and an eerie silence that blanketed the rainforest before each sighting. These weren't just ghost stories told by firelight. They were warnings. Something had been awakened, and now it was hunting not for survival, but for domination. Back in the United States, a private military contractor named BlackRock Global was quietly brought in. Unofficially, they were hired by shadow figures within the government to clean up the mess and recover the asset. But what the boots on the ground didn't know was that this wasn't just a search and destroy mission. They were walking straight into a genetic war zone, a proving ground for a new kind of bioweapon designed not only to kill, but to think, adapt, and rule. Among the elite units sent into the jungle was Commander Jack Mason, a battle-hardened veteran known for surviving the impossible. Mason wasn't told the full truth, only that the target was a rogue experiment. Alongside him was Dr. Leela Grant, the bioengineer who had helped design the original containment systems for the creature. She had been forced out of the program after questioning the ethics of weaponizing nature. But now she was back, not by choice, but because she was the only one who might understand what they were truly dealing with. As their chopper descended into the dense canopy, the tension was electric. They weren't just going in blind, they were being used as bait. Within hours of landing, the team encountered the first signs: entire stretches of jungle stripped bare, bones picked clean with surgical precision, and unnerving silence that even birds dared not break. Their communication soon went dark. GPS became unreliable. Compass needles spun in circles. It was as if the jungle itself had become a living organism controlled, perhaps by the very monster they were hunting. As night fell, the first attack came swift and without mercy. 2 soldiers vanished without a sound. The third was found minutes later gutted, eyes wide with a terror no man should die with. The team tried to regroup, but paranoia began to seep in. They weren't just dealing with a predator. They were facing something far more intelligent. The creature began manipulating their movements, driving them deeper into its territory with a cunning that suggested military-grade thinking. Dr. Grant began noticing strange patterns in the environment: trees felled in strategic formations, animal carcasses arranged like warning signs, and nests constructed with a deliberate geometry. This wasn't instinct. This was design. Mason realized they were in a controlled experiment, and they weren't the hunters. They were the test subjects. As they pushed further, they stumbled upon a hidden lab, long abandoned and overrun by nature, yet filled with clues. Data logs, mutated embryos suspended in tanks, and journal entries from long-dead scientists revealed the horrifying truth. The creature wasn't the only one. There were others, variants, failed hybrids, some destroyed, some missing. The Amazon was now an open-air arena for bioweapons evolution, and their arrival had triggered the next phase of the experiment. As the team dwindled under constant ambush, Mason and Grant formed an uneasy alliance. They had to think like the creature to survive. They needed to embrace the same ruthlessness that had been engineered into it. Using old intel, they constructed traps, manipulated sound to confuse its sonar-based perception, and turned the terrain into a battlefield. But for every move they made, the predator countered. It wasn't just reacting, it was learning. In one of the film's most harrowing sequences, the remaining team is forced to retreat through a flooded cave system, only to realize too late that the creature can move through water faster than land, swimming with terrifying silence just beneath the surface. One soldier is dragged away, his muffled screams echoing through the dark chambers like a ghost. Eventually, the conflict becomes deeply personal. Mason begins to unravel, haunted by memories of past missions gone wrong. He sees in the creature a reflection of himself, a weapon shaped by war, abandoned by those who made it, and now seeking purpose in destruction. Dr. Grant, meanwhile, starts to question the very definition of life. If this predator could strategize, adapt, and even manipulate its environment to such a degree, was it truly just a beast? Or was it something new? A sentient evolution of humanity's darkest ambition? In a final confrontation atop the ruins of an ancient temple, the lines between man and monster blur completely. The predator stalks Mason and Grant with surgical precision, exploiting their every weakness. But just when all seems lost, Grant uses her understanding of its neural design to trigger an overload, an acoustic frequency that scrambles its internal equilibrium. The creature falters. Mason moves in. A brutal hand-to-hand fight erupts. Primal and raw, more like two titans clashing than soldier versus beast. When it's finally over, Both predator and predator maker lie broken. But victory is hollow. The jungle still hums with an unnatural silence. Grant and Mason are airlifted out, survivors of something the world will never fully know. As they rise above the canopy, the camera lingers on the jungle floor where another pair of glowing eyes flicker open in the darkness. The experiment has only just begun. In the days that followed, the energy inside the funeral home began to shift. What once felt like a solemn place of rest now pulsed with a dark, hungry tension. Objects moved without touch. Shadows slid across walls, even when no one stood near. And the few workers who still dared to stay overnight whispered of hearing breathing deep, ragged, and far too close. Sometimes the scent of decay would waft in through the vents, thick and nauseating, even though the embalming room had been cleaned spotless. It was as if something was rotting not in the walls, but in the very soul of the building. A funeral. Assistant Matthew Klein, who had been working there for less than a month, began to lose sleep. He claimed that every time he closed his eyes, he saw a long hallway inside the home that didn't exist in reality. It was always drenched in red light, lined with coffins that opened slowly, never revealing their contents, but always creaking. Just enough to let dread seep out like blood beneath a locked door. He left his job without a word and was later found wandering a nearby field in the pouring rain, muttering prayers in languages no one recognized, the owners desperate to contain. The rumors and retained business began denying everything. But denial was not a strong enough wall to hold back what was coming. One morning, during a routine burial, the automated lift system in the preparation room malfunctioned and dropped a body with violent force. Cameras later revealed that no mechanical issue had occurred. The machinery had been disengaged, as if someone had pressed the manual release switch, but the footage showed no hands. That same week, a body awaiting burial was found mutilated in its sealed coffin, its mouth torn wide in a scream, though it had been stitched shut after embalming. Police involvement increased. Inspectors came and went, but nothing explained what was happening. The funeral home began losing clients. And yet, despite the chaos, the owners refused to shut it down. Some believed it wasn't about money anymore. Some believed they had made a deal. Or a mistake. One night, a visiting priest named Father Leone, who had heard the whispers and had spent his life studying demonic phenomena, arrived unannounced. He carried with him a cross carved from the wood of a cursed tree, said to have once bled during a possession. He walked through the home slowly, sensing, muttering, tracing signs in the air. In the embalming room, he stopped. He said he heard laughter childlike but guttural, then screams. Not human screams, something older. Something that did not belong in this world. Father Leone began reciting prayers, louder and louder, until the air grew so thick with pressure that his nose bled and he collapsed. He woke up hours later on the marble floor of the mortuary, his hands burned in the shape of two small fingerprints pressed into his palms. He left without finishing the ritual. "I will not return," was all he said before disappearing into the fog. From that day forward, the funeral home was no longer a secret to the locals. People began avoiding the street entirely. A woman who lived across from it claimed her windows cracked every time a new body arrived. Children walking home from school crossed the street when passing, eyes down, lips sealed. Some swore that they saw lights flickering inside, even when the building was empty. Others said they saw a figure in the third-floor window at midnight. Its mouth impossibly wide, as if still screaming from the grave. No one went in, but the building remained open. Occasionally, someone would disappear, usually a vagrant or a stranger passing through town. Some of them were found weeks later, lifeless, pale, their eyes glassy and locked open in terror. Some were never found at all, and always the smell returned. Always the shadows deepened. The home had become more than cursed. It had become a living thing feeding on grief, on silence, on fear. And the town, held hostage by its presence, did what humans always do in the face of ancient evil. They looked away. They spoke of other things. They told themselves stories that made them feel safe, but the truth had already dug in deep. The walls had already learned to breathe. The floorboards had already learned to whisper. And something beneath the surface, something old, patient, and cruel, was just beginning to wake up. The final section of this dark chronicle leads us deeper into the unsettling questions that have haunted each step of this story. Who really controls death, memory, and truth? Behind the closed doors of the embalming room, secrets don't just rest, they fester. As authorities began piecing together the fragments of evidence, they were met with resistance not just from the suspects, but from the very institutions meant to serve justice. The local police department had ties to the funeral home through years of unrecorded services and discreet favors. Old case files involving unexplained deaths, dismissed investigations, and premature burials resurfaced with disturbing frequency. Whispers emerged of officers being paid in silence, families given free burial packages in exchange for disappearing complaints, and bodies switched in the morgue before autopsy results could be finalized. These weren't just coincidences, they were the architecture of a hidden system built to shield the guilty and bury the inconvenient. As the pressure from the outside world mounted through media scrutiny, independent investigators and grieving families demanding answers, the true scope of what the funeral home represented became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just a business of the dead. It was a stage, a carefully crafted theater where death was manipulated, records were rewritten, and certain corpses were never meant to be found. But what made the case worse was the realization that the funeral home may have only been a cog in a much larger machine. Many of the names on the altered death certificates shared ties to criminal organizations, offshore accounts, and secretive government programs aimed at human experimentation, witness elimination, or financial fraud. Through life insurance scams, what looked like a gruesome local horror began to resemble something more systemic, more orchestrated. A macabre nexus of criminal networks, corrupted power, and institutional decay that had long hidden behind the respectable facade of a mortuary. The emotional weight on the families involved reached unbearable limits. Several of them reported receiving anonymous threats, cryptic phone calls at night, or being followed by unfamiliar cars. One family whose daughter's body was discovered, with organs missing, tried to push a civil case forward, only for their legal team to back down suddenly, without explanation. Some believe the lawyers were bought off. Others suspect they were warned. One of the journalists covering the story, a young woman determined to expose everything, went missing just days before she was set to publish a full expose. Her final notes later found in a password-protected file contained references to a clandestine group known only by an initial, who may have overseen operations in multiple funeral homes across the country. While no hard evidence connected this group to the crimes directly, their mention was enough to spark conspiracy theories, dark web investigations, and even copycallers who wanted to emulate the twisted artistry of the embalming murderers. In the years that followed, the town never fully recovered. The funeral home building, after being shut down and locked by authorities, became a symbol of everything people feared but could never name. Teenagers dared each other to break in. Paranormal investigators claimed to record voices and cold spots. Former workers who once denied involvement began confessing bits of truth on their deathbeds. Even then, the truth remained elusive, shrouded in contradictions and silence. Rumors claimed that certain bodies were never found because they were burned in secret cremation chambers hidden in the basement. Others claimed that some of the corpses were never dead at all, but drugged into a catatonic state to be experimented on while alive. These are the stories that turned the case into legend, the kind that blends horror with reality until you can no longer tell the difference. And maybe that's what makes this story endure, the feeling that the dead never left, that their secrets are still waiting just beneath the surface of polite society, embalmed in deception, buried in plain sight. In the heart of a quiet town where death was supposed to bring silence and solace, the funeral home had become a chamber of unrelenting noise, echoes of secrets, suffering, and sins buried beneath polished mahogany and masked by prayers. Sixth chapter in this tale of shadows and whispers pulls us deeper into the psychological unraveling of those trapped within the orbit of the funeral home killers. It is no longer just a story of what happened inside that building. It is the story of what it did to those who survived it. The survivors, few in number and fractured in mind, carried the weight of that horror in different ways. One of them, a young embalmer named Cashin, had once taken pride in the gentle ritual of preparing the dead. For him, the process was sacred, a way of honoring lives that could no longer speak for themselves. But after the revelations of what the funeral home had been hiding, Cashin's hands trembled each time he touched a lifeless form. He could no longer tell where his work ended and the corruption began. His dreams became haunted by faces of the deceased that opened their eyes and whispered things he couldn't understand. Cashin's descent into sleepless paranoia mirrored the fate of many who once worked there, each of them marked in some way by the things they witnessed, or worse, helped cover up in silence. For others, like Detective Rowan Thorne, the trauma became an obsession. The case had been closed, the killers arrested, the bodies counted and catalogued. But Rowan knew the file was far from complete. There were pieces that didn't fit: unexplained disappearances, missing evidence, signs of a larger network that the media had refused to touch. He began to re-interview witnesses who had gone silent. Some had disappeared without a trace. Others refused to talk, their eyes full of something colder than fear knowledge. He became convinced that the funeral home had been only one doorway, in a corridor of deeper horrors. Late at night, he would sit alone in his apartment, poring over old reports, photographs, surveillance tapes that no longer played back the same way. Faces blurred where they hadn't before. Background shadows shifted positions. It felt like reality itself was rejecting his need to know more. But the more he unraveled, the more he realized this wasn't just about a murder case. It was about a system, a ritual, a pattern. And then there were the families, the ones who had buried loved ones there, never knowing the truth of what had been done to their bodies, their dignity stripped in the name of experimentation, trafficking, or occult manipulation. Grief turned to fury, but fury turned to futility. Lawsuits disappeared. Protests were silenced. Compensation was promised, but justice was never delivered. A mother whose daughter had been cremated in that home began to receive anonymous letters. They contained details about her daughter's final moments that had never been made public, details only someone inside the House of Horrors would know. The mother, driven by a blend of desperation and maternal rage, began her own investigation. She followed leads through the darkest corners of the internet, eventually finding chat rooms and encrypted forums filled with whispers of a cult-like society that used death not as an end, but a transition, a harvest of power and secrets. The funeral home was simply one of many sites across the country, each one connected by symbols, rituals, and a ledger of names that seemed to go back generations. As these separate threads wove together, they painted a chilling image of how deeply rooted the darkness had become. The funeral home killers may have been the face, but they were not the architects. They were foot soldiers in a larger war against silence, sanity, and the sanctity of the dead. Among the more disturbing revelations came from forensic data recovered from the basement of the funeral home. Hidden within sealed drawers and decaying cabinets were journals, not just of embalming notes, but confessions. Names, dates, and rituals described in meticulous detail. Some pages were written in blood. Others were encrypted, their codes broken only by experts in ancient languages. The journals referenced figures from history, alchemists, necromancers, and unsolved cases across centuries. It became apparent that the funeral home had not simply been a business, it had been a node in a dark continuum. Every generation had its chosen, and those chosen had to prove loyalty through sacrifice. Those sacrifices were often made beneath the guise of normalcy, wrapped in tradition, hidden in plain sight. Cashin, torn by guilt and plagued by hallucinations, finally broke his silence to Rowan. What he described was beyond the scope of any criminal report. He spoke of a secret room behind the embalming chamber, one not on the blueprints. It was circular, lined with mirrors and stones etched with unfamiliar sigils. Cashin claimed he had once been forced to witness a ritual there. Not a murder, but a transformation. A body placed at the center, surrounded by chanting staff, and then lights failed, the temperature dropped, and something inside the room breathed that shouldn't have. When the lights returned, the body was gone, vanished. The staff resumed work as if nothing had happened. Cashin had told no one, convinced he had hallucinated it all. But he described it with such clarity, such precision, that Rowan believed him. As word of these accounts began to circulate in underground communities, a dangerous curiosity began to fester. Thrill seekers, conspiracy theorists, and occult practitioners all wanted a piece of the legend. Some tried to break into the funeral home before it was demolished. Some succeeded, only to vanish or re-emerge days later speaking in tongues, unable to recall their names. Footage recovered from one of these intruders showed symbols on the walls glowing faintly, reacting to proximity. Sounds in reverse speech. Whispers calling to someone named Ariel or Azrael, depending on interpretation. It was unclear whether the place was haunted, cursed, or simply tainted by years of ritual energy. But something had been opened, and it had not closed. In the years that followed, Rowan published a manuscript detailing what he believed to be the real truth behind the funeral home. It was rejected by every major publisher. He was labeled unstable, disgraced, and quietly removed from the force. Cashin disappeared not long after, his apartment found ransacked but untouched by forced entry, the mother searching for her daughter. Last seen boarding a private boat to an island rumored to house one of the cult's original temples. None of their stories ended cleanly. They frayed like old rope unraveling in water, slow, silent, and inevitable. But despite the erasure, the forgetting, and the collective silence that followed, a seed had been planted. One that grows in the shadows, nurtured by whispers, fed by fear. They say if you listen closely near the demolished ruins of that funeral home, you can still hear the whisper of embalming machines turning on by themselves. You can hear footsteps, pacing where no floor remains. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, a name will carry across the air your name. The funeral home killers may have been caught, but the thing that lived beneath them, the belief, the power, the hunger, that never left. It merely waits for the next chapter. There's a silence deeper than death, one that blankets the aftermath of truth unspoken. In this silence lie the secrets of experiments that never made it to the light. Files buried in steel drawers, behind locked doors, whispered among the few, and understood by none. Somewhere in the dust of wartime files and psychiatric wards, there lived the story of a name erased from history, Dr. Marius Voss, a man once hailed as a genius in neuropsychology, now vanished, removed, struck off records. Not because of his failures, but because of what he achieved. His legacy was neither celebrated nor condemned. It was swallowed whole by governments too afraid, by institutions too implicated. The human mind had always been the final frontier, but Voss discovered how easily it could be redrawn, rewired, by something far more primal than thought, sound. Not music, not speech, frequencies, vibrations, patterns of resonance that could bypass cognition and command the soul like a puppet string. He called them subharmonic directives, and once they were embedded, the mind no longer recognized them as foreign. The host would think, believe, act, even dream as though the implanted command was his own idea. All without ever knowing he'd been touched. The early trials were subtle. A handful of volunteers, most unaware they were even subjects, began to exhibit strange habits. Some abandoned careers to wander aimlessly. Others developed obsessions. With symbols, with numbers, with the sound of dripping water. But the real terror began when Dr. Voss applied the theory at scale. During what appeared to be a series of unrelated power outages in Eastern Europe, an entire village was turned into a living case study. Speakers hidden in street lamps, static in radio broadcasts, hums in broken televisions. By the time investigators arrived, they found the townspeople huddled in their homes, murmuring the same 7 words over and over again in perfect unison, as if rehearsing a forgotten scripture. It is not me who chooses this. No one could explain why. No one remembered hearing the message, but it was there lodged in their minds like a splinter behind the eyes. Voss had proven his theory. The subconscious was programmable, and the world was not ready. But someone had been watching, not from the government, not from academia, from elsewhere. An untraceable syndicate, one with no name, no flag, no allegiance, offered Voss what no lab, no grant, no university could: a free hand and unlimited funding. He accepted. What followed were 12 years of vanishment. No record of travel, no death certificate, no sightings. But every few years, a strange rumor would surface, a man appearing in war zones just before outbreaks of collective madness. Reports of towns fleeing en masse from voices only they could hear. Whispers of entire units in the military breaking rank to walk straight into the sea. Always the same pattern. Always the same shadow. By now, Voss was no longer conducting experiments. He was refining a weapon. The syndicate called it Project Nightveil. Its purpose was singular: to rewrite allegiance, to fracture will. Not through torture, not through persuasion, but through a low hum played just below the range of hearing. Played long enough and the mind would unravel. Identity would slip like threads coming undone until only suggestion remained. Soldiers who once held their rifles with honor now dropped them at the sound of a tone. Political dissidents who resisted interrogation would suddenly confess details they hadn't even remembered knowing. Entire cells of resistance dismantled not with bullets, but with vibrations. It wasn't science anymore. It was alchemy turning thought into clay, molding man into myth. And yet, even within the syndicate, there were doubts. Whispers that Voss had gone too far, that the tool had become a mirror, reflecting not just control but madness back upon its maker. Surveillance footage recovered from a failed raid on one of their outposts showed a room lit only by blue light. In the center, a figure standing motionless for 8 hours, eyes unblinking, arms outstretched, whispering something no one could translate. When the footage was analyzed for audio spectrums, investigators found a harmonic frequency buried under the ambient noise, too low for ears, too precise for chance. The figure was Voss, and he wasn't in control anymore. Something had echoed back. Those close to the project began to disappear. Not killed, not silenced, just gone. One by one, their homes found empty, journals half-written, meals still, warm, no signs of struggle, no sign of departure. And in every case, a single note left behind: I have remembered something that does not belong to me. Those words became legend among whistleblowers, urban explorers, and darknet researchers. No one knew what it meant. But it was the last thing anyone said before they were never seen again. The most disturbing story came from a man named Elias Trenner, a sound technician who worked unknowingly on one of Voss's early field tests in a decommissioned asylum in France. He claimed to have wired the building with speakers for what he was told was a psychological drama performance. But midway through the week, he noticed things that made no sense. Shadows on the walls that didn't match the actors. sounds that seemed to respond to thoughts rather than voices. One night, while checking the main frequency board, he blacked out. When he woke, his fingernails were missing, but there was no blood. Instead, someone had carved something into the bone beneath. Coordinates. GPS points that led to the center of the Dead Sea. He never went. He never spoke again. He was found 7 years later, floating in a sensory deprivation tank he built himself in his garage, repeating the same sentence. We are not hearing sound, we are being heard by it. Somewhere, the original waveform that Vos discovered still exists. Some say it's encoded in a wax cylinder buried inside an unmarked church in Lithuania. Others say it was etched into a record made of obsidian, played only once, then shattered by those who survived. But the most chilling theory is that you don't need the sound itself anymore. You just need the memory of having heard it. That's the final layer of control. You carry it with you, dormant, until triggered by a word, a smell, a flicker of a forgotten face. The seed has been planted in countless minds. Yours, mine, maybe even those watching this very video. The silence between sentences may not be empty. It may be listening. It may already have heard what it needs. When Vos finally resurfaced, if it was even him, he was no longer speaking words. Witnesses claim he walked into a rural radio station in Alaska, barefoot and bleeding from the eyes, and began to hum. Not a tune, not a song. Just a perfect vibrating note that shattered every light bulb in the building. The staff went missing. The recording of the incident was seized, but a local teenager had captured part of it on a broken tape deck. That tape made its way online once for 8 seconds before every copy was wiped. Those who listened said they saw things in the static, shapes behind their eyes, ideas that didn't belong to them, dreams they'd never dreamed but now couldn't forget. One listener cut off his own ears. Another claimed she finally understood her purpose but refused to say what it was, choosing instead to write symbols into her skin until there was no skin left. The waveform was named Vos Note, and if it still circulates, it does so under layers so deep, even the dark web fears to index it. The question now is not whether control exists, but how deeply it has already taken root. The people in power, corporate, governmental, even spiritual, may not be directing the frequencies. They may just be echoes themselves. Puppets pulled by tones they can no longer hear. And if Vos succeeded in creating true subconscious command, then the collapse of free will isn't an event waiting to happen. It's a program already running, right now, right here, inside the minds of those who believe they are the most free. Because the final truth he uncovered, the one buried beneath all the terror, was not that we can be controlled, but that we were always being controlled. That our thoughts were never ours to begin with.